The airport was a blur of motion, with passengers rushing to and fro, some hurrying to catch their flights, others leisurely strolling, chatting as they passed by. The hum of conversations, the clattering of suitcases on the polished floors, and the announcements overhead filled the bustling terminal. But in the midst of all the chaos, one figure stood out. She entered the terminal with an air of confidence, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her gaze scanning the crowd with a sense of superiority. She was well-dressed, her tailored suit fitting perfectly, her designer handbag hanging from her arm like a status symbol. Her hair was perfectly styled and her makeup flawless. Everything about her screamed wealth, refinement, and privilege. Yet, as she walked past the others, there was something in her eyes, a flicker of disdain, as if she was somehow above the people around her. It was clear that she felt out of place among the ordinary travelers, those who didn't share her lifestyle or status. Her posture was rigid, her chin held high, as though the hustle and bustle of the airport was beneath her. She moved with purpose, heading straight toward the gate for her flight. A business trip was the reason she was here, an important meeting that could determine the next step in her already successful career. This flight was just another part of her world, a world where she never had to worry about the little things. She approached the gate, scanning the area for a place to sit while waiting to board. As she did, her eyes landed on a man who had just walked in, looking a little lost in the crowd. He was casually dressed in simple clothes, nothing flashy. He looked around, almost unsure of where he needed to be, perhaps a bit uncomfortable in the busy environment. Her eyes narrowed as she took in his appearance. There was no mistaking the judgment in her gaze. She watched him for a moment, a sense of distaste creeping into her features. She didn't know who he was, but she already made up her mind. He didn't belong here. And yet, something told her this encounter would stick with her. She could already feel the tension building. The woman made her way to the boarding gate, her steps purposeful and steady, though there was an undercurrent of impatience in her gait. She'd already been waiting for a while, and the plane was about to board. Her mind was focused on the business meeting ahead, but she couldn't help but feel her irritation grow as the crowd continued to swell. It was as though the people around her didn't know how to conduct themselves, too loud, too disorganized. She glanced at the seating arrangements and found her assigned seat, an aisle seat, right in the middle of the cabin. She wasn't happy about it. She would have preferred a window seat, but she wasn't about to let something as trivial as that ruin her day. She sat down, smoothing her skirt and adjusting her bag before pulling out her phone, her attention on the screen rather than the people around her. As more passengers started boarding, she couldn't help but notice the man she had seen earlier. He was walking toward her, his calm demeanor and simple clothes drawing her attention again. He wasn't dressed in the same high-end fashion as the rest of the passengers, nor did he carry himself with the same air of confidence she had. His clothes were basic, nothing flashy, just an unremarkable jacket and jeans. There was nothing about him that screamed success or importance. Her discomfort grew as he came closer. The man didn't seem in any rush, walking toward his seat with an almost casual ease. She stiffened as he passed, her eyes flicking to his face, then quickly back down, as if she could will him to keep moving and sit somewhere else. But of course, he didn't. He moved toward the seat next to hers. He didn't ask if the seat was taken. He simply sat down, settling in with a soft sigh. The woman's heart rate picked up, and a sense of unease washed over her. Her fingers tightened around her purse as she shifted in her seat, adjusting her posture to distance herself from him. As the final passengers boarded, she could feel the man's presence beside her, his calm and relaxed demeanor irritating her even more. He wasn't uncomfortable, he wasn't fidgeting. In fact, he seemed perfectly at ease, like he belonged there, unlike her, who could barely mask her distaste for his presence. She couldn't help herself as she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for him to hear, "Really? This is unbelievable." She took a deep breath and, with an exaggerated sigh, moved her purse to the seat beside her. It wasn't necessary. The man wasn't trying to take up her space. But in that moment, she wanted to make sure he knew just how inconvenienced she felt. She positioned the purse in such a way that it took up a significant portion of the seat, as if to silently tell him that this was her space and she wanted no part of him being in it. The man didn't respond. He didn't react. He simply settled in, leaning back in his seat, eyes closed as if preparing for the flight ahead. The contrast between him and the woman couldn't have been more striking. Her tense, rigid posture, every muscle in her body wound tight, while he exuded a quiet calmness. It only made her more anxious. Why didn't he seem bothered by her behavior? Didn't he notice how uncomfortable she was? Or was he just ignoring her? As the flight attendants called for the final boarding passengers, the woman couldn't help but glance at him again, her gaze flicking to the man's face, then quickly away. Her stomach churned with irritation. She felt trapped, her seatmate's presence like a weight pressing down on her chest. The plane was filling up, and she was stuck. There was no way out. She couldn't escape him, not now. She wasn't sure what she had expected, maybe for him to get the hint and move somewhere else. But he didn't. And that, more than anything, made her blood boil. The woman's patience was wearing thin, her discomfort growing with every passing minute. The man beside her, seemingly oblivious to her irritation, adjusted his seat slightly, settling in more comfortably. The sound of the movement, just the subtle shift of his body against the upholstery, felt like a sharp needle poking at her already frayed nerves. She couldn't stand it. Each little thing he did seemed to make the situation worse. The quiet click of his shoes against the floor, the way his hand brushed against the armrest, the deep, even breaths he took. Everything about him was so calm, so at ease, and that only highlighted how tense she was. She could feel her heartbeat quicken, her breath coming a little faster as her frustration mounted. Why wasn't he acting uncomfortable? Why didn't he sense how much she wanted him to leave? The more she thought about it, the more it became clear. She couldn't stand him being so unbothered by her silent judgment, by the way she was clearly trying to distance herself. Unable to sit still any longer, she stood up abruptly, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. She turned toward the flight attendants, who were moving down the aisle, checking for anything that might need attention. Her voice, already tinged with irritation, cut through the air as she spoke. "Excuse me," she said, her tone sharp and a little too loud. "Can you do something about this?" She gestured toward the man next to her, though she didn't meet his eyes, choosing instead to focus on the flight attendants. Her voice quivered with barely contained frustration as she continued. "I really don't feel comfortable sitting next to this man." The attendants exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. One of them, a younger woman, hesitated, glancing back at the man before looking back at the woman. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said with a calming smile, trying to diffuse the situation. "The flight is full, and there are no other seats available. Unfortunately, you'll have to remain in your assigned seat." The woman's frustration flared. She had expected a different response, something that would validate her discomfort, that would allow her to avoid the man beside her. But instead, she was being dismissed. Her voice grew louder now, her irritation impossible to hide. "No," she said, her tone growing more demanding. "This is unacceptable. I don't want to sit next to him. Can't you make an exception? I'm sure there's something you can do." The flight attendants were clearly uncomfortable now. They exchanged another brief glance before the older attendant spoke, trying to stay composed. "I understand your frustration, but there's nothing we can do at this point. The flight is fully booked." But the woman wasn't ready to let it go. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice ringing out in the cabin, drawing the attention of several passengers. "You're telling me there's nowhere else I can sit? I can't believe this." She was practically shouting now, her anger boiling over. The black man sitting next to her, who had been silent through all of this, finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers for the briefest moment. But he said nothing. He simply watched her with a calmness that only seemed to frustrate her further. She felt her blood pressure rising. She wasn't going to let this man ruin her flight, ruin her comfort, and she wasn't going to let anyone tell her she had to sit here and endure it. She spoke louder now, making sure everyone around her could hear her discontent. "I don't care how full this flight is," she spat, looking at the flight attendants. "I'm not sitting next to him. Do you really expect me to stay here?" Her voice was a mixture of disgust and disbelief, the words slipping from her mouth without any thought. The tension in the cabin thickened, and the murmurs from nearby passengers grew louder. People were starting to take notice. The black man, still calm and composed, shifted slightly in his seat, but he didn't respond. He didn't react to her words, didn't engage with her. His silence only made her angrier. She had wanted him to react, to say something, to give her an excuse to keep attacking. But he didn't. He just sat there, unmoved by her words. The flight attendants, caught in the middle of this awkward confrontation, tried once again to pacify the woman, their voices now quieter but still firm. "Ma'am, we understand that you're upset, but we've already told you there are no available seats. Please try to relax, we're about to take off." But the woman's voice only grew sharper, more demanding. "I don't care, you don't understand. This isn't right." The more they tried to calm her down, the more agitated she became, her words growing more venomous with every second. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath as the tension grew unbearable. The woman's anger had been simmering for far too long. Her frustration, her discomfort, it had all built up into a pressure that she could no longer hold inside. The flight attendants had tried their best to calm her down, but nothing had worked. And now she could feel the heat of her emotions rising, suffocating her. She couldn't take it any longer. With a sudden, sharp breath, she stood up from her seat, her voice now louder than before, a shrill scream that reverberated through the cabin. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her eyes wild. "I feel unsafe sitting next to this man." The words were out before she could stop them, and as soon as she said them, the entire cabin fell into a heavy silence. Every pair of eyes turned toward her, and the awkward tension in the air thickened. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what was happening, unsure of how to react. The woman's voice continued to echo in the otherwise quiet cabin. She pointed an accusatory finger at the man beside her, her face flushed with fury. "He's a threat to me. A random person, someone who doesn't even belong here, sitting next to me. I don't feel safe." Her words cut through the cabin like a knife, each one laced with unspoken prejudice. The murmurs around the plane grew louder, passengers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, glancing between the woman and the man, who remained still, his expression unchanging. The man, who had been silent throughout the entire exchange, finally shifted in his seat. The contrast between his calmness and her escalating rage was striking. He slowly stood up, his movements deliberate and controlled. For a moment, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. The woman froze. She hadn't expected this. But then, the man did something she hadn't anticipated. He straightened his back and spoke, his voice calm, firm, and commanding. "You're making a scene for no reason," he said, his gaze unwavering. "And your behavior is making everyone uncomfortable." The woman blinked, caught off guard. There was something about the man's tone that made her stomach drop. But before she could say anything, he continued. "I'm not just some random person," he said, his voice carrying through the cabin. "I'm a well-known philanthropist, a successful business leader, and your actions, right now, are humiliating for both of us." Her heart seemed to stop. The words hit her like a cold slap across the face. The man was someone important, someone whose presence she had belittled without a second thought. Her stomach churned with embarrassment, but she couldn't look away. The room seemed to shrink, and she felt every pair of eyes in the cabin on her. The flight attendants stood there, frozen, caught between doing their jobs and witnessing a situation that had spiraled out of control. They exchanged awkward glances, unsure of how to handle the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The woman's face drained of color. The anger that had once surged in her veins was now replaced by something much more uncomfortable. Shame. She had made a mistake, a massive one, and she could feel the weight of her own ignorance crashing down on her. The man, after giving her a moment to process the words, calmly sat back down in his seat. His posture was relaxed, unaffected, as if the confrontation had never happened. He didn't glance at her again, didn't engage with her any further. He simply went back to his place. The woman, on the other hand, was no longer angry. Her entire body had gone rigid, and she couldn't find the words to say. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and the passengers continued to whisper among themselves, their discomfort now directed at her. The weight of what had just unfolded hit her in waves. and her mind raced with regret. Her hands, which had been tightly gripping the armrests, slowly relaxed, but the damage was already done. Her behavior, driven by entitlement and prejudice, had been exposed. She couldn't take it back. The humiliation was overwhelming. The flight attendants quietly moved away, no longer speaking to her. The rest of the journey seemed to stretch on endlessly, with the woman shrinking into her seat, wishing she could disappear. The man beside her, still calm and composed, gave no indication that he was bothered by her outburst. But the truth was clear now. She had revealed herself for who she truly was, and it was something she would never be able to undo. The remainder of the flight was heavy with tension. The woman, once full of indignation, now seemed to shrink in her seat. She avoided eye contact with everyone around her, her gaze fixed downward, as if willing the time to pass more quickly. The man beside her, still calm and composed, didn't engage with her any further. He sat in silence, but it was clear to anyone watching that the earlier interaction had affected him. He wasn't visibly upset, but the coldness between them spoke volumes. As the plane continued its journey, murmurs spread through the cabin. Passengers whispered to one another, some still trying to process what had happened, others simply exchanging glances. The flight attendants, now quiet and reserved, spoke in hushed tones amongst themselves, well aware of the tension that had unfolded. They seemed uneasy, as if the atmosphere had shifted irreversibly. By the time the plane began its descent, the woman's mind was a swirl of regret and shame. She couldn't escape the weight of her actions. With the flight almost over, she forced herself to speak to the man beside her. I'm sorry," she said. The words were flat, lacking sincerity. Her voice trembled slightly, and it was clear that her apology felt more like an obligation than a genuine attempt to make amends. The man didn't acknowledge her apology. He didn't even look at her. He simply stood when the plane landed, gathering his things with a quiet efficiency. He walked down the aisle without so much as a glance in her direction, his back straight, his composure unshaken. He left the plane without a second thought, leaving the woman sitting there, her face burning with humiliation. The damage had been done. Word of her outburst spread beyond the flight. Her reputation, built on entitlement and pride, had crumbled in an instant. As the woman disembarked, she was left with a stark realization. Her actions had consequences, and those consequences would follow her long after the flight had ended. Thank you for watching this intense and eye-opening story. It's a powerful reminder of how our actions, driven by prejudice and entitlement, can have lasting consequences. This woman's behavior not only changed how others saw her, but also revealed the importance of self-reflection and the need to treat everyone with respect, no matter who they are. If you found this story thought-provoking, don't forget to like, comment, and share with your friends to spread the message. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any more incredible stories. Your support helps us keep bringing you more content like this. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. How would you have handled the situation? We'd love to hear from you. See you in the next video.